Hi, everyone. Good evening. Glad you came. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College. I'm just going to give me 2 minutes to do a tiny bit of housekeeping so that other people can come in as we start. And okay, I'm going to highlight you or spotlight you, Katy, so that everybody sees. And I will spotlight myself. Okay. And one last quick thing. I am going to send this to Facebook and I'm going to put on captions because people always ask for that, which is, I think, good to have. Okay. Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for being here tonight. As I mentioned, I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College. Probably have seen a lot of you around on Facebook or from some other presentations. And I'm here tonight with Katy Langhorst. And Katy has been with us for a few times. So I know that her presentations are A+. And if you want to learn about testing, which we're going to talk about tonight, you will learn a lot. So as always, put your questions in the chat. We will try and get to them. I mean, I'll be looking at them as Katy goes through her slides. I'll kind of interrupt her if to answer some of them. But if I don't ask her one, it might be because I know she's going to answer it, shortly after that. But again, before we really dig in, I'd love to know if you can put it in the chat where you're watching from. How many kids you have, what kids do you have in high school, what year they are. I assume that a lot of people here tonight have a 10th grader, an 11th grader. And if you might have an older child, if you've been dealing with college test optional. I was thinking about that this morning, Katy. I was thinking, some of these things we've talked about so much already for us. Not that they're ever old because there's always something changing, but we've talked about it, like we're kind of a little used to it. Not that we should ever get used to things in admissions because they're constantly changing, but for all the families that are kind of coming in, things that are kind of natural to us, oh yeah, we understand test optional, we understand what's going on, but this is all completely new to these families, so
yeah, absolutely.
Completely can understand if it's overwhelming. But that's why it's great to be here and to hear Katy and to get all of your questions answered. So Katy is the National Director at StudyPoint Tutoring, and you've been there, gosh, for over 10 years. And I'd love if you can tell us a little bit more, Katy, about your background in education, because I know it's very impressive.
Thank you. Sure. And yeah, and for the folks going through this for the second time, depending on how old your older one is, things may have changed quite a bit too, is some of the complication as well. The landscape has shifted a lot in the last 2 years. So if your older child is 3 or more years older, it's kind of a different universe. Sure, a little bit about me. So I have a degree in child psychology from Yale, my undergrad degree, and then I worked for a few years running learning centers in the Connecticut area. Then I decided that my heart really lay in the classroom, and I went back and got a master's degree in elementary ed, and I was a public school teacher for 5 years, taught 4th and 5th grade in New Hampshire. Loved it. Left in 2007 to have my son on what I thought would be a 1-year maternity leave, and ended up kind of finding StudyPoint through some old friends and came on originally as a curriculum consultant in what I thought would be kind of a part-time opportunity while my kids were tiny, and never left. And so I have done a lot of different things at StudyPoint. I've done a lot of coaching, sales management, service management, curriculum, tutor training. And I'm actually right now in the process of taking over as CEO of the company as the two co-founders are stepping back from day to day, and I am taking over the company. So that is a little bit about me. And I have 2 children. I have a 10th grader, so I am right in the midst of this with you, and we will talk about him at the end because he, like any of you who have class of 2025 kids, are in this weird position with the SAT in terms of changes. And then I have an 8th grader who's going through the high school application process. So I am living and breathing this stuff every day. And she's taking her SSAT on Saturday and already trying to think about her schools are test optional and should she submit or not. So this is very much my day-to-day world at this moment.
So Katy, not to point anybody else, but something caught my eye that a parent put in the chat who has a class of 24, 26, 28, 30, 32. So
oh my gosh,
good luck.
My
heart goes out to Lisa and managing this over the next few years, but you'll be able to do it.
She'll be a pro. She'll be a pro.
Right.
Yeah, she can give the presentation in a few years. She'll know it all.
Right.
Terrific. Well, let me dive in because I have a lot to cover. I'm going to talk us through basically a bit about kind of admissions testing, really SAT and ACT testing, and kind of things parents should know at this moment in time. Again, with the caveat that Debbie mentioned, which is things are changing and things are changing really rapidly at moments. So we'll sort of talk about the state of the world as it is right now and what I have for predictions for the future. And then I'm going to try to leave time at the end for questions. I will keep half an eye on my second screen for any questions that come up, but it's hard to watch and talk at the same time. So Debbie will do a great job, I know, of kind of interrupting me. Totally happy to be interrupted and to get sidetracked on other topics that are relevant. You know, I can roll with whatever will be most useful for all of you. So jumping right in, we talked about questions. Here's kind of the three big topics that I have planned to cover. One is, what is test optional? Because seems simple, but is actually kind of complicated. So what does it mean, and what are the different sort of flavors and varieties of test optional in the college world today? How much do test scores really matter? It's a hard question to answer, but I'll give you my take on it. And then what advice do I have for really current sophomores and current juniors who are really in the thick of this? So jumping in a little bit, in terms of what has changed over the last few years, and by few years, I'm talking really 2020 and on with the advent of the pandemic, really test optional has become a much bigger thing. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but the biggest shift, if you had a student go through this process in 2020 or before, is the landscape on where tests are required and where they aren't and what they mean has changed. Because of that change, there's been a really dramatic shift in application trends. You know, to steal my own thunder from a few slides from now, as schools have become test optional, way more students are applying to schools. So that has changed the dynamic for admissions officers, for parents, for students, in terms of what the percentages look like of students getting in, what the admissions office process is like, where they're handling dramatically more applications than they were a few years ago, and how all of that is playing out. Also, with the SAT, the College Board ended the essay and ended the subject tests about 2 years ago, I think now. That was in the works pre-pandemic. It was not spurred by the pandemic, but is a change. If any of you had students go through it before or remember from your own days in this process, those SAT subject tests, those are no longer in existence. And the essay, with a few tiny exceptions, is no longer a part of the SAT. And then we'll talk a bunch towards the end about the digital SAT, which is coming in 2023 and will affect the class of 2025, so current sophomores and below, in a bunch of different ways, and we'll talk about that. That's a pretty big change. It's not the first time the SAT has made a big change. I think we've gone through 3 or 4 iterations in the 13 years I've been in the test prep world, but it is a pretty dramatic shift and does have some implications, particularly for current sophomores. So that's kind of the high level of some of the changes. To just level set a little bit on definitions, excuse me, there are kind of 4 main flavors of test optional. And every time I give this presentation, I Google around a little bit to see if anybody's come up with a new one. And there's always new ones that schools are kind of playing around with these definitions and schools are trying to be transparent about their policies and also a little cagey about it. So these are the 4 main flavors of test optional that you will see out there in the world today, separate from, of course, the other category, which is test required. So the most common one right now is that schools are test optional. And what that means in a practical sense is you can choose to submit either an SAT score or an ACT score. There's a spot on the application for it, essentially, where you can put it in and have the score sent, but it isn't required. So we'll talk a little bit about what does that mean for admissions, but from a straight definition, it means they will take it. If you send it, they will consider it, they will look at it, but it is not required. That's the most common flavor of this out there right now. The other ones that are less common but also exist are schools, and this seems to be increasing a little bit at this moment, schools that are calling themselves test flexible, which sort of sounds like optional, but is actually a little different. So test flexible schools say, we're not going to tell you what score to submit, what kind of test we want, but we want something. So they kind of give you a menu of options for a score to submit, whereas in the pre-COVID days, it was almost all schools required SAT or ACT. Those were all of your choices. Test flexible schools say, give us something, and here are some options. SAT, ACT, IB scores if your child's in an IB program, AP exams, advanced placement exams will count. Things like New York Regents or other kind of state or local standardized test requirements, standardized tests that are required by a school will count. I'm sure I'm missing some, but it's basically we want a score, give us something, but it doesn't have to be SAT or ACT. In reality, in many ways, that ends up being a test required school because the vast majority of kids will submit an SAT or ACT, but it does give students a little bit of wiggle room to choose to use some other score that they have. The third type, which is, again, is sort of an interesting one, is test preferred, which is basically technically test optional. We're not physically requiring an SAT or ACT score. You can complete the application without it, but they'll say in their application materials or on their website, we really, 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 really want you to submit an SAT or ACT score. So it's kind of a way for schools to leave that little bit of a door open, but state to you that their preference is that they want you to submit a test score. In many cases, test preferred schools, if you're not going to submit a score, ask for a reason. So for example, I was working with a student who had a concussion just before the fall and therefore wasn't able to test. And so that application went with a note that said, this student had a concussion. Other situations like that where you can explain, maybe there's a learning disability involved or other family circumstances where the student truly wasn't able to test, that is okay in a test preferred situation, even though the school wants a test if you have one.
So Katie, I'm just curious,
Please, yeah.
in the test preferred, the schools don't really, that's a term, maybe they call themselves that, but they don't necessarily, they don't always put that on a website per se. They will call themselves test optional. The reason I'm bringing this up is because you won't really necessarily know that they're test preferred unless you dig into the website where they kind of talk about what they want, how they review applications.
Great point. Definitely. It's hard to know. Usually there's a paragraph in there somewhere that kind of gives like their testing philosophy.
Right.
You can sort of read it and say, okay, this makes sense.
So, that's why I'm bringing it up.
Flashing lights.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unfortunately, it's another kind of thing that families have to scour the website and see if, and that's a great term because so I've seen that where where colleges actually term the paragraph our test philosophy or our testing philosophy. And so, that's what you kind of need to look for.
Yep, definitely. And then the last category is the most clear cut, which is test blind, sometimes called test neutral, which means you cannot submit it. There is not a field for it in the application. They will not look at it. There's been a lot of reports in the media recently about like kids trying to sneak a test score into an essay. I was reading an example the other day about the essay topic was tell us about an adult who inspires you, who's a role model. And the student wrote, something like, oh, I'm inspired by my mom because she helped me to get an SAT score of 1600. It's like, wait a minute. So, test blind, they will not look at it. They will black it out of your essay. Don't try to sneak it in. They won't look at it. They have no interest in seeing any test scores at all. Those are pretty limited, and I think we have this on another slide. The schools that are test blind are basically the University of California system. The whole system is test blind for the moment, and then a handful of other schools. If you Google test blind, you can find a list, but it's a pretty limited list at this moment. The vast majority of schools are either test required or some flavor of test optional. That's some terms. A little bit of background as to why have so many schools not only gone test optional, which the biggest driver there was the pandemic, but why have they stayed test optional? And this is, a slightly controversial topic, depends a bit on who you ask. But, if you read schools' explanations for why they have gone and stayed test optional, they're saying that they're doing it out of compassion for students going through the pandemic and in difficult situations, recognizing that a test does not tell the whole story of a human being. I 100% agree with that. And really trying to increase equity in schools. They're trying to boost diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. They're trying to really kind of level the playing field as much as they can. All of those things are terrific. They are not necessarily playing out that way in many colleges, but that's the goal. What has actually happened in the world of test optional that has kind of reinforced this is, as I said, there's been a dramatic bump in applications for schools that went and stayed test optional. And so if they're getting, as an example, double the applications, the percentage that they're accepting has dramatically dropped. So they look a lot more selective because twice as many kids are applying because the testing barrier is no longer there. Because the U.S. News and World Report rankings, which many of you I'm sure know, hold such sway in the admissions world, we could talk for hours about whether or not they should, but they do, that those rankings are based in part on their selectivity and the amount of applications that they get. So there's a bit of a numbers game going on here. And so I point that out because as parents, we can't control that. It is what it is. But it is a piece of the picture here. And as you start to look into some of the data, which we'll look at in a second, you'll really see how it's playing out. Important, again, to point out U.S. News and World Report, which is a big factor still in the admissions world. It is interesting, some of you may have seen a couple of law schools 2 weeks ago removed themselves from the U.S. News and World Report rankings because they said they didn't agree with them. I have wondered if that might start a tidal wave of it. Haven't seen it yet. We shall see. But these rankings are quite controversial, and they have their fans and their detractors in the world of admissions officers. But again, for this moment, they are a big deal. One thing that's important to know as it relates to test optional is that schools are penalized slightly on their score if less than 50% of an incoming class submitted test scores. This has been in flux, and this could certainly change in the future. So again, understanding this underlying motivation here that while schools can say they're test optional, some of that test preferred stuff comes from they want to make sure for the sake of their rankings that their test scores stay strong and that the percentages stay high. In terms of how test optionals played out, again, huge increases in applications. We'll look at that in a moment. There's also been a real move towards early decision and early action, which is, again, a whole other topic for another day. But as those numbers have increased, more and more students are applying early, and colleges are turning to their early pool more and more heavily to fill their classes. Those two things together have resulted in a record-breaking drop in admissions rates, the percentage of kids that get in, and way more students on wait lists. Colleges had a well-tuned machine that allowed them to know if we need to fill 1,000 slots in our freshman class, we need X amount of applications, we're going to accept this many early and this many regular, this many will accept us, and we'll end up with 1,000 kids in September. All of that math went out the window in the last couple of years, and they've really been struggling to kind of figure out this new landscape. Their goal is to get 1,000 great kids in the seats for September. How they get there has shifted quite a bit.
And Katy, and it's kind of like you're reading in between the lines what you have here, but the other thing is that the number of applications per student has increased,
yes,
which adds to what you. Oh, sorry.
Yes, you're right. We've done this before. Yes, exactly. So kids are applying to more schools because they don't have this barrier of testing. And so for the class of 2021, they applied to about 20% more colleges each. 2022 kind of evened off. They only applied to a little bit more, but 20% more colleges per student adds up to a heck of a lot more applications. So yeah, that is absolutely
and that's what adds to the uncertainty from the college standpoint in terms of yield.
Right.
So, because now you've got
their math is messed up,
right? Because they've accepted a student, but now that student has potentially many more options, so they don't have an idea of what percentage of the students will actually come.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, great point. Here's some of those charts and graphs for the math folks among us that you can kind of see. This is the greenish bar is the number of applications that school received in 2020, the number in 2021, and the number in 2022. This is for the classes that they accepted, so the spring of 2022. We obviously don't know this year's numbers yet, but you can really see those bars climbing up. This is just number of applications. You can see some schools are up 30 to 50% from where they were in 2020 to where they were this past year. And then, just basic math, all of their acceptance rates have dropped a pretty similar amount in terms of the percentage of students that they've accepted. So, again, these numbers are pretty dramatic and are meaning it's not that fewer kids are getting into the school, it's just that the pool has expanded, so the percentages are smaller. So that's that one. Here's a little bit of data on the early trend that we mentioned. So the orange bar is the percentage of the class that was admitted early in 2022. So how much of the class did they fill from their early pool versus in 2021, what's happened? And here you can really see that it's a big number. Colleges are filling 20 to 50, and this is just a handful of examples of their classes from the early pool. And this is a continuing trend. If we looked at these numbers for 2017, 2018, 2019, they'd be quite a bit lower. And that's because in many cases, early decision is binding. Therefore, they know if they accept a student, that student will come. So as Debbie was saying, their calculations on their yield, trying to fill up that class of 1,000 kids, they know that the kids in this pool will come. So it kind of shifts their math and their calculation a little bit. Then the question becomes, how do kids do who submitted tests versus didn't? This is some data that shows the percentage of kids who applied without tests versus with tests and how they fared. This is a tricky one because the percentage of kids who get accepted and have tests is always going to be higher. We have no way to know. There's never the same student with a test and without a test, right? It's always a whole picture that they're looking at. So what's the cause and what's the effect here is a little complicated. A stronger student is more likely to have a stronger score and therefore is more likely to submit it and to get in. So we can't necessarily draw a straight line between you submitted a score and you had a better shot, because the kids submitting scores are the kids submitting strong scores. So happy to answer questions about that later because it's a little confusing, but it's important to know. Parents often say, does submitting a score increase their chances? Really hard question to answer. Submitting a good score certainly increases their chances, but it probably would have in the world of tests required as well. What's going to happen in the future with test optional? To some degree, your guess is as good as mine. It's very hard to know. Two prominent schools have gone back to test required for the coming years. MIT was the first and the biggest, and that happened this summer, I believe, June or July or so. And then Purdue just announced November 29th, so a week ago, that they're going to require scores for next year as well. There are a handful that never went to test optional. We'll look at a list in a moment. What will this look like a year from now when my student is in this process? I don't know. I think we're going to see more and more schools going back to test required. But a lot of it is, someone told me the other day that the class that entered started school in 2021, so they are the class of 25 from college, if I did that math right.
Yeah.
The kids who are current sophomores in college, are the most statistically studied class in the history of higher ed. Everybody is watching that class because none of them had test scores, or very few had test scores. And so colleges are pouring a lot of resources at watching how these kids do and seeing what are their graduation rates like, what are their GPAs like, are they successful on their campuses? And then looking at the following class, the kids who are freshmen now, where it was like 60-40 in most schools, kids with scores, kids without. They want to see, were those scores an important predictor that helps them make good admissions decisions, or do they not need them? How all of that data analysis plays out in the next couple of years, I think will shape what the future of test optional looks like.
And Katie, you kind of mentioned it. It's not that yes, maybe they're using test scores to predict, whether a student will come and is appropriate, but really they're also using them to predict, will that student be able to perform at the college and graduate in 4 years, which is really important.
Right.
And will their, GPA be on par or better than previous classes? Because all of that, Right, because if all of that changes, it means that maybe students need more help. I mean, I hate to bring it back to just a numbers game, but it means, that it's more support that the colleges have to provide, which costs money. If they have a drop in 4-year graduation rates, that's actually a huge impact to a lot of things, bond ratings, rankings, that type of stuff. So
definitely, yeah, it's huge. And as kind of a brief aside, we're a company that does test prep and also academic support. We work a lot with college academic support. We've seen a gigantic jump in our college students needing help with academic courses. And what those students are telling us is that the tutoring offices in colleges are incredibly overwhelmed. There's like a weeks to months wait to get tutoring appointments at colleges. I don't think that's test optional, to be clear. It's COVID, right? All those kids had a disrupted high school world, now are arriving at college, in some cases less prepared than the college is used to, are needing more tutoring and support services, and are finding that schools that promised they had lots of support services are overwhelmed very quickly. So I've heard that about tutoring support and about mental health resources are the two places where colleges are struggling to keep up with the demand. Again, I don't think that's test optional necessarily. It's COVID related, but it is interesting that they want, once a student gets to their school, they want to support that student, help them to graduate and be successful. That's a lot harder than it was a couple of years ago. This we sort of talked about. This is just a layout, again, kind of a confusing graphic, but it shows you what percentage of schools were test optional versus test required pre-COVID, where were they in the fall of 2020, and what seems to be happening. So you can see that the number of tests required dropped quite a bit during COVID for obvious reasons, and then has been slowly climbing back up. The question is, what does this graph look like a couple years from now? Again, I think a lot will depend on that data analysis going on right now. Which colleges, as of this moment, require tests? This is not a comprehensive list, but this is the big ones. MIT, Georgetown never went test optional at all. MIT was kind of the first to go back, the first major one to go back. The Georgia schools are test required. Purdue, we mentioned. The kind of main Florida schools are test required. The University of Tennessee is as well. And now just recently, now all U.S. military academies, they were sort of split. A couple were, a couple weren't. As of the last couple of weeks, they are now all test required. I'm sure there are more I'm missing. Every time I show this slide, I Google it again to see if I can check. But these are the ones that show you overall that as of the most current list, which are test required at this moment. Other thing that's important to know, and this, if there's one thing you take away, I think this is probably one of the most important slides, which is even at a college that is test optional, in many situations, tests are still required, which I know sounds counterintuitive. Many schools will say, I am test optional as an institution, but if you want to apply to nursing, to engineering in particular, to business programs, for those specific majors or schools within the university, tests are required. If you are an athlete applying for athletic scholarships, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, tests are required. Merit scholarships, Florida Bright Futures is the most well-known, but there are lots of them. Many, not all, but many merit scholarships are test required. Some colleges require or at least use test scores for course placement. So if you have a high SAT math score, they will place you out of the lower level of math. So not required, but helpful. Some schools, if you are an out-of-state student, an international student, or a homeschooled student, they will require a test, even if the institution as a whole is test optional. So important to really, as Debbie said, kind of research the website, dig down a little bit and really understand it, or call and ask. Admissions offices have people who will answer the phone and answer your questions, but really important to know the details. I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had with parents who get to fall of senior year and realize they thought they didn't have to worry about testing, and all of a sudden they do. So please do not make that mistake. Really understand the requirements, and if you're going to make the choice not to test, make sure you understand all the different pieces of it. Other thing that's important to know is that some schools that are truly test optional, and therefore you don't have to have a test score at all, use an index where they basically take your GPA, your class rank, and your test score if you submit it, and kind of create this other score. So basically, and you know, Debbie sent me an article today that I didn't have time to clip, but in there was a quote that said, basically, if you're not going to submit a test score, make sure you're extremely exceptional in everything else. You know, I sometimes liken it to a dating profile, right? The photos in a dating profile are optional, right? But if there's not a photo there, you got to be really exceptional in all of the other ways in order to get through people's kind of filters and choices. So some schools will ask for additional materials if you don't submit a test, like a graded paper, academic work, you know, a scientific paper. Some schools will say if you don't have a test score, add an extra recommendation letter. Again, the schools are trying to make good decisions, so they're looking for a thorough picture of your student. So again, to reiterate, make sure you really understand the requirements of that specific school and the programs your students are applying to. Key thing here too is to know if you're a college admissions officer and test scores are now not present in some applications, what's the next most important criteria? In that, admissions officers will universally tell you it's GPA and kind of academic record. So that's tricky now because over time in the last 4 or 5 years, and this is a pre-pandemic trend that has continued through and after the pandemic, more and more students are graduating with perfect GPAs. So that, you know, it is harder and harder to distinguish yourself. Some colleges calculate it as weighted, some unweighted. They look at the rigor of your coursework. So it's not a simple one number. And so colleges will put those GPAs into context based on knowing what your high school is, what courses they offer, and how that all goes together. But as this grade inflation trend is continuing, again, it's harder and harder to help your students stand out. This is basically the same thing. This is grade inflation overall versus ACT composite scores. So ACT composite scores have been really consistent since back to 2010, have really hardly budged at all, down a hair. We don't have 2022s yet. I would bet they were down another hair, but look at the overall high school GPAs, kind of interesting. I'm going to stop there for a brief moment because the next slides we're going to move on to digital SAT. Were there any questions around kind of test optional, Debbie, before I jump into
earlier
kind of other advice? Yeah.
Somebody asked, and this isn't a straightforward answer, but what is considered a good SAT score?
Good question. No good answer. Totally depends on the school. It is entirely dependent. You know, there are, I think, 4,400 colleges in the U.S. There are ones across the whole range, right? If you're applying to Harvard, the score that you're going to need to get in there is going to be dramatically different than another school. So it's really about using research tools out there. Debbie's website has a great one to understand when you look at a particular school your student is interested in, looking at what their average score range is. So schools will give you, okay, I'm looking at the test scores for Boston College, you know, and these are not real numbers, I'm making these up, but their range, you know, the range of kids who are in the 25th to 75th percentile of their admitted class might be, again, I'm making this up, 1,200 to 1,300. That gives you a sense of the range. That range is going to be very different depending on the school. So what is a good score totally depends on where you're trying to go.
Another question about, do colleges look at GPAs from every high school the same way?
Great question. No, I touched on that a little bit, but no. So colleges are real, especially competitive colleges, have very detailed profiles of every high school. So they have a sheet, or as I'm sure it's computerized now, that gives you all of the information about how many AP classes are offered, what's the student-teacher ratio, what are the resources like at that school for college counseling and kind of guidance counseling support, how big are the classes, all that kind of thing, what's kind of the overall demographic of the community. So if, for example, you go to a school that offers tons of AP classes and don't take any, they know that those were an option for your student and that you chose not to take them. If they're comparing that transcript side by side with a student who goes to a school that does not offer any APs, but the student took the most rigorous course load they have available, they know that, and they will weigh that context as they're looking at the GPA and the academic record.
Here's a good question. Haven't seen this before. Let's see. So I just lost it for a second. About, can you, or let me just see. Oh, is it possible to submit a math or an English SAT score, or I guess, you know, a section of the ACT to a test optional school? So basically, is it possible to just submit just a portion of the test scores?
As far as I know, no, I've never seen that as an option. I can't say never because there's so many schools that it might be an option somewhere, but no, it's a whole score or no score. You will send for the SAT, your total, your math and your reading, but you can't choose one or the other.
So somebody's asking, saying that they thought that the digital SAT was going to be in place in 2024. I think it originally was announced, right? And then it got moved.
Yes, we'll come to that one in just a moment. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Okay.
Any other test optional questions? I'm going to talk about ACT versus SAT. That's coming. Okay, this is a good one. If you're in the middle at 50%, you should submit a score. But what if you fall over 25 but under 50? That's a great question. So talking about a score range, a hypothetical school. If you're generally, most everybody will tell you if you're at the 50th percentile or higher, you should absolutely submit. If you're in the 25th to 50th range, the question to ask yourself, and we'll come to this a little bit in a second, but is, does that score enhance your application or detract from it? So if it kind of matches and helps support the goodness of the rest of your child's application, you should include it. If it's going to stick out, if the application is otherwise a really stellar application and you feel like the score is hurting it, you should keep it. You should not submit it. You should choose not to submit it.
So one last question,
answer, but it depends. Yeah.
Maybe before you go on, somebody's asking, and I'm assuming if their student has both an ACT and an SAT score, should they submit both or should they pick one versus the other?
Pick one versus the other. Most schools will only look at one. Depends a little bit on the school, but they will only look at one. There's a chart called the ACT-SAT concordance chart that you can just Google concordance and you'll find it, that tells you an SAT score of X equates to an ACT score of Y. Pick whichever one you're higher on and send that one.
Okay, I think some of the other questions you're going to get to.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, let's talk for a moment, kind of take a little detour into the digital SAT. So this affects class of 2025 and younger. So if you have a junior and that's your last kid, you can take a nap for a few minutes because this does not affect you. Anybody with a 10th grader or younger, this is an important thing to know. So in terms of the timeline question, as of the spring of 2023, all international tests will be given as digital, international. They've actually given their last paper-based international SAT already. It happened last week. So that's for international. In the US, as of the fall of 2023, so the October, that's a little less than a year away, the PSAT will be fully digital. There will not be a choice. We have given our last paper-based PSAT 6 weeks ago. So that will be fully digital from here on out in terms of the October PSATs. For the SAT, the full SAT, beginning with the March, I don't know if we have a specific date, but the March 2024 SAT, from there on, it will be fully digital. Again, there will be no choice of paper or digital, with a small exception of certain special ed accommodation situations. But overall, it'll be fully digital, the SAT, from March of 2024 and on. So if you are a freshman, if you have a freshman, their whole world will be digital, assuming they go SAT. If you have a sophomore like me, they're a little bit in this funny spot where sort of if they test early, they will be on the paper-based test. If my son, who's a sophomore, decides to take the test, say this coming summer or next fall of his junior year, that will be the paper-based test. If he waits and takes it later in his junior year, it will be the digital test. So that sophomore class is sort of this funny situation where they have a bit of a choice. What is the right choice? I do not know. It's a very good question. We're all trying to figure that out. I think it's going to depend on the student for sure and their own strengths and weaknesses, their comfort level with digital tools, et cetera. But again, sophomores will have this kind of choice depending on their timeline. Everybody younger, fully digital. Everybody older, fully paper. So that's a key thing to know. What's different, other than obviously it's digital? The biggest thing, and the one that has gotten the most press and joy from many students, is it's a heck of a lot shorter. It's going from 3 hours and 20 minutes, I think it is today, to just under 2 hours. That's a pretty big difference. And one of the hardest things about these tests, the SAT and the ACT, currently is sitting still for 3 hours with only a handful of breaks is very challenging for students and adults. And just maintaining focus, we very consistently see whatever section came last is the section the kids often struggle with because they're tired. It's a lot to sit and focus. So that is a pretty dramatic difference, shortening it by 30%. It's also what's called stage adaptive, which there's a lot of nuance here that I won't have time to go into all of the details, but the short thing to know is based on how you answer the first set of questions, the second set of questions for each section can be harder or easier. That's how they're able to get what they are saying will be scores that are just as accurate in a third less time. There's more time allocated per question than on the current SAT, so less time pressure. That's huge for many students where time pressure is what they struggle with. There's this countdown feature in the corner that kind of counts down how much time you have left. So they have much clearer access, students, to where they are timing-wise. It is entirely calculator allowed, which is new and also pretty giant. Current SAT has a calculator part and a no calculator part. There's a sheet of reference formulas that the students have access to through the whole math section. Reading also is pretty dramatically different. They have shortened all of the passages. So the paper-based version is a lot like what many of you might remember. Currently, it's a 4 or 5 paragraph passage and then 3 to 5 questions about that passage. So you're kind of bouncing back and forth, looking at the passage, looking at the questions, looking at the passage. New SAT, the digital, is a short, they're like this long, paragraph-ish of reading material and 1 question. Then the next one, paragraph, question, paragraph, question. So it's quite different, and the strategies are going to be different. For example, we teach students on the current SAT, go read the questions first, then go back and read the passage. That's not going to be as big of a thing on the new SAT because it's just paragraph, question, paragraph, question. The results are going to come back much quicker, which I think will be a great improvement for students. Right now, it takes 2-ish weeks for SAT and about 6 weeks for PSAT scores. They're saying now it'll be days, not weeks. They haven't narrowed that timeline, but a few days is kind of hugely better. I know there were a bunch of questions there, Debbie. Do you want to?
Yep.
Yeah. Want to fire some at me? I was watching him go, but can't read and talk at the same time.
What's your sense with the new ACT coming? Will colleges prefer ACT scores or SAT scores in this kind of new period because they might not know much about the new SAT scores?
Right. College Board is doing a ton of work statistically and in terms of PR to convince colleges that the new SAT is just as good as the old SAT and they shouldn't change their policies, which currently are every college in the US accepts both and has no preference. How that will play out, I don't know. The College Board, they've done a very sophisticated job of validating this test and saying a score on the new one. The same kid who took the new one and the old one would get a very similar score. So my guess is, at least to start, colleges won't change their policies. They'll accept both equally.
So somebody's asking, and I'll read it because if the test is digital, can they, meaning students, still use scratch paper? I'm assuming that's for, figuring things out.
It's a good question. I am 90% sure the answer to that is yes. There's also kind of a scratch paper tool in the digital platform itself. I know this in part because the SSAT, the high school entrance exam that my daughter's working on, is in a similar platform. So there'll be kind of digital scratch paper. I am 90% sure, although I can confirm, that they can have pen and paper next to them as well. None of that work, of course, will count. It's just whether they got the question right or wrong, but I believe they can have paper with them.
And then there's a question about the PSAT that's changing in October 23rd. Sorry, October 2023. Is that going to be also adaptive, like the digital SAT?
I believe so. They haven't entirely answered that question, but from what we understand, yes, it will be shorter. They haven't said how much shorter. My guess is it'll be a similar amount shorter that the SAT is shorter, and that it will be stage adaptive. The College Board has not fully released that information.
And here's a good question. If you have a sophomore and they end up taking the digital version and the paper version, and they super score across those tests?
We think so. Again, that's going to be up to individual colleges. My guess is yes, but colleges are going to have to make that decision. Super scoring, for those of you who might be new to it, is when you take, let's say you took SAT in October and then you took SAT in December. In October, I did great on the math, but terrible on reading. And then in December, I did great on reading and terrible in math. Many, but not all, colleges will take your best of both and put them together and call your score your highest math and your highest reading, even if they're on different test dates. That's what super scoring is. It's going to depend on the colleges. I would predict that yes, they will super score, because in theory, if the College Board can prove that the scores are equivalent, it shouldn't matter. It's going to be college by college to decide that one.
Here's another good question. It actually brings back memories for me about taking the test, because somebody's basically asking, you know, in terms of the reading section on the digital test, will kids be able to highlight within the passage? I remember like highlighting, you know, important things.
Yeah, there's a cool tool. Again, digitally, yes, there's a cool little tool that allows, like, kind of like you can do in Google Docs, where you can highlight it. Yes. They can also mark it up. They can cross things. They can circle words. Same on math. They can write right on the screen, all that kind of stuff. Yep.
And just to confirm, is the scoring range staying in the 1600?
Yes, same, 1600. Yep. There was a brief period a bunch of years ago where they went to 2400.
Yeah.
They went back to 1600. I don't even know what year, 2012 maybe. And yes, it's staying the same.
Okay. Well, there are questions about the ACTs, but I know you're going to talk about that.
Good one. Yeah, next one. What's the ACT going to do? Again, I do not have a crystal ball. I do not know. This lady is Janet Godwin, who's the head of the ACT. She gets this question everywhere she goes. I've seen her speak publicly a bunch of times. You know, I don't think they've decided, to be honest. What she is saying publicly is they're working on a digital option, but they will not make the full cut. They're saying they will not make the full cutover like the SAT has. So what they're envisioning, what they say they're envisioning, is a future where there is choice on the ACT, paper or digital. They are talking about adaptive testing, and they are talking about a shorter test, because I am sure they are worried that, you know, if you ask a kid, would you rather take a 3.5-hour test or a 2-hour test? Everyone's going to pick the 2-hour test. And these are businesses that don't want to lose market share. So that is supposedly in the works. They are saying that they will keep the paper option and that they're focused on accessibility. They are skeptical that College Board can make this transition seamlessly and that there won't be major tech problems. Again, equity and access issues in schools where devices are not as available, all those kinds of things make this transition complicated. So the ACT currently is saying, you know, we're the test of stability. That SAT stuff sounds kind of sketchy. Like, just come back to us. You know us. You love us. We're calm and peaceful and over here and being stable. So that's what they're saying. How that plays out as the digital SAT rolls out, whether they change that tune, I do not know. But right now, there are no specific plans announced, and they are saying that they want to be the test of stability.
Well, and it's a good question here, and related to what you're just saying about stability. How do you, not to put you on the spot, Katie, but how do you, doing test prep, how do you prepare students for the digital test? Like, when are there samples available? You know, how do you,
they have now released, great question. Yes, they have now released 4, I think 3, I can't remember exactly, fully digital practice tests. The test prep companies like ours are dissecting and understanding and figuring it out. Many companies have either contracted or developed their own digital platforms for practice. So we, for example, have a bank of thousands of practice problems. We have contracted with a company to build a digital platform that will look and function just like the real one that we can then load all our practice problems into to give students lots of practice material. So, you know, we believe strongly that you should practice how you play. So if it's going to be a digital exam, we want the practice to be digital. The SAT did also release several, I forget what they call them, sequential practice tests or something, where they basically took the problems from the digital version and put them into a paper PDF, so that if students want to see what the problems look like and practice them that way as well, they can. Again, obviously you can't replicate the adaptive thing in paper, but they have released a bunch of practice material, especially for the reading, that passage question thing, because that's so different, in kind of paper form, if students want to practice both ways.
So are there other tests like that students take throughout, like in high school? I'm just trying to think. I mean, this adaptive is kind of new to me. I personally can't think of my own kids that they had to take any form of an adaptive test. I think that whole concept is kind of like, is going to be, you know, very something that students and families have to get used to.
Absolutely. And all of us have to get used to. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the GRE, the graduate school exam, has been adaptive for a bunch of years. I took it many, many years ago, and it was adaptive and computer-based then, and that was probably 2000. So they've been doing it for a long time. The GRE is what's called question adaptive or item adaptive, where each question that you answer, essentially the next one is chosen based on how you did on this one. SAT is not that. The first section will be the same level of difficulty for all students. Then the next section adapts itself, so it's a little bit different. The theory, the kind of rumor had been they were going to do question by question adaptive. They did not. I don't know why. So yeah, it's new and it's different. You know, how the strategies play out, and is a bit of a, you know, guessing game at this point. But yeah, it is very different than anything else. That's the only one I can think of is the GRE that does it that way.
And what about logistics? Like somebody is asking, do students bring their own laptops to use, or are schools and testing centers going to have laptops available?
Yeah, all of the above. So you can bring your own device, and the school will basically install a software into it that kind of locks everything else out except for the testing program platform. They will have devices at schools provided by the College Board for schools that might not have enough laptops, because, you know, you could have 200 kids testing at a time. And if schools have laptops in their own, or computer labs that belong to the school, same, they can download this software to sort of lock down everything but the testing platform. So they are saying that, you know, the devices will be fine and everything will be good. They've also set up a way that, like, if internet connectivity goes down or the power goes out, I have not tested it, but theoretically it saves the scores. It's got like a saving mechanism in there, so that shouldn't affect things. If the internet is flaky, they say that will be okay. I haven't tested it in real life, but they say they've thought of all of those things and it's all going to be fine.
Oh, I'm looking forward to all those stories about, right? Speed, internet speed getting in the way of, which I'm sure there will be, it slowed down my students and, that type of stuff.
I know it is. Yeah, we shall see. Some of the open questions, some of which you guys asked around the digital SAT: how will colleges react? What are they going to do? How will super scoring work? Someone asked that one. What will students prefer? It's hard for me to imagine that students aren't going to prefer a 2-hour test, but some kids have really mixed feelings about digital tools, especially when we all lived digitally during COVID. So there may be some students who really prefer the paper-based test. We don't know. And then what's the right approach for sophomores? Again, I'm happy to take questions about that. It's a very tricky question to answer. What should sophomores do? Being sort of caught in the middle of this change. Many test prep companies and professionals are saying, if you have a sophomore, avoid this whole thing and go ACT and wait it out, because then you don't have to decide digital or paper and when do you take it. And I saw a question about sophomore year PSAT. Yes, it's weird. Their sophomore year PSAT is paper. I had my son not even take it in October for that reason, because I said, this is silly. There's no reason to take a paper-based sophomore PSAT, when your PSAT is definitely going to be digital. So many people we are hearing from are fleeing to the ACT for this 1 year, and then we'll see how it shakes out. It's very individual depending on your student's kind of situation. This sometimes comes up. Stop me if there are other questions, Debbie, but people often ask me for my take on SAT versus ACT, so I put together this slide. Basically, there are 3 main differences between the SAT and the ACT. One is the amount of math on each test. So the SAT is half math, half reading. ACT has 4 sections, one of which is math. The other 3 are all reading language based. People sometimes get thrown off by the science section on the ACT and assume, understandably, that it's a science section and that it probably has math in it and, biology, chemistry, physics kind of science. It really doesn't. It's really I call it a critical reading section with a science theme. So everything you need to know to answer the questions on the science section are in the passages, the graphs, the charts. You don't actually have to have any science content knowledge. Sometimes kids who are really, really good at science way overthink the science questions on the ACT and try to apply all their awesome biochem and physics knowledge to these questions and get thrown off. The questions on the science section are really not testing science. They're really testing critical reading strategies and reading charts and graphs. So that's important to know. So if you have a student who is a great math student SAT allows them to highlight that strength. The opposite is true. If you have a student who's really great at kind of reading, language arts, vocabulary, grammar, ACT will help because they'll be able to highlight that strength. So that's one key difference and probably the biggest. The other one is the pacing, and this is true of the old SAT, and it's even more true of the new SAT. SAT is a little slower paced. It is still timed, there is still time pressure, but the time per question is a little more relaxed. And again, they've relaxed it a hair more as we've gone to digital. ACT is a kind of bang, 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 keep going, move pretty quickly, don't get bogged down or you won't finish kind of test. SAT gives you a little more time to kind of think it through. So knowing the sort of work style and personality of your kid is important as to, are they a kid who can move right through and do well and not get thrown off by that and not get bogged down? ACT is a good choice. Is the pace of the ACT going to make them very anxious, and are they likely to get thrown off and not finish? SAT is a better choice. So those are really the two key differences, the amount of math and the kind of speediness of the test. Then there's this digital paper-based thing, depending on what grade your student is in.
Does the ACT still allow you to retake just a section of the test?
No, they never did that. They
never really implemented it.
Yeah, about two, at times a blur to me, 2 or 3 years ago, they said they were going to call it section retesting or single section retesting. And they were going to say if you did great in 3 but bombed 1, you could take just the 1 on a day by itself. They never rolled it out. And they haven't really talked about it in a while. So I don't know if they will at some point, but that does not exist today.
Seems to me like it would be a good competitive advantage if they wanted another.
Right. I know. Call Janet Godwin and tell her. Yeah,
right,
no,
right.
I'm sure it's on their list. I'm sure it's on their list. But yeah, it is. I think the logistics of it are hard, I think, is my guess as to why they didn't do it, because now you have a test center full of kids and you have these kids are taking just reading.
True.
These kids are taking reading and math. This one's taking just English. My guess is that logistics is hard to manage in a room of 300 kids and one proctor. So
right.
That's my assumption, but I don't know that for sure. Should my student take the test? Obviously I'm a little biased here because I work for a test prep company, but I think there is absolutely no harm in trying it. They should take a practice test that is a not official test. In other words, it's not going to count. Their score will not get reported. You can download them for free off of the College Board website or the ACT website. There is a free digital practice test also on the College Board website in the real platform. That is going to give you a sense of where your student stands. We offer free virtual proctored tests every weekend. We'll send out the link. You can do it that way. Again, these are authentic practice tests, but that the score doesn't go anywhere but to you. That is a really good way to get a sense of where your student is and how they react to the test. You can take a real test and not send the score. Slight asterisk after that, which is there are a handful of schools that require you to send, or ask you, technically they don't require, ask you to send all scores. So there is some risk to going in and just kind of giving it a roll and seeing what happens. There aren't many schools that fall into that category, and theoretically, if you take it again, you'll show progress and they'll factor that in, but just do know that there are some schools that will see all of your scores. It's going to give you really good feedback on your student. How much did COVID learning loss affect them? How do they react to these tests? So giving it a shot, particularly in a practice test situation, is really helpful. Should they do test prep? You might think I'm going to say yes. Not necessarily, honestly. I think it's really a very individual decision for each family to understand what you need. The average score increases for our test prep, and it's comparable. We do a lot of data collection, is around 4 points for the ACT and around just under 180 for the SAT. It can range a whole lot depending on your students. It really depends a bit on your timeline, your calendar, your student's schedule. How far is your student from what you think their potential is? How big a factor is merit aid? It can be worth spending money on test prep if it's going to result in a much bigger scholarship. So if that's a factor, that is a big thing, and the kind of return on investment there can be quite huge in some cases. How long is your list? How important is having a good score to the formation of that list? If your student has their heart set on a couple of schools, having a good score is probably more important. If they have a nice wide variety of 10 or 15, some of which are likely to be comfortable for them in terms of admissions, you might not need it. So understanding your individual context is really important.
So, and Katie, one more, right?
Yeah.
Would you add is that in this environment where we don't know where things are going,
Right.
you know, we don't know
Often,
what
yeah.
schools are going to change their policies next year. And so again, it's
Totally.
just to honestly have all the options at your students, fingertips, and they might have a test and then completely decide not to submit it, but at least they have it. And if the school's policy changes, they're not at the last minute having to figure out whether they're going to test then or not.
And as I said, we have that conversation all the time. Panicked seniors in October. Yeah, don't become a panicked senior in October, at least not about this. Have an option, Again, you can always decide not to submit it, but have a score that you feel good about. This chart people sometimes find helpful. This is very broad and very general, but this gives you a basic sense of when a college is trying to figure out if an SAT or ACT score kind of matches or complements a student's GPA, what does that sort of mean? This is a hard slide. People often ask, does this mean weighted or unweighted? Again, it totally depends on the colleges, how they're going to interpret it. GPA can be very complicated, but it just gives you a bit of a sense of, if your student's a straight A student and their SAT score is 1,000, that is a big gap from kind of where you would expect their SAT score to be versus where it is, or vice versa. If they're a lower grade student and they have a higher score, on the SAT, that's going to enhance the application. Again, do not take this chart as set in stone. It's just kind of general guidelines. Super briefly, I know we're almost at time, but should I submit my score? We've kind of talked about this, but you should absolutely submit it if you're happy with it. If the college is competitive and you think that test score is an important piece, you should submit it. Merit aid is a thing. Absolutely submit it. If your scores are at or above a college's average 50th percentile, absolutely submit it. If you feel based on your whole portfolio, your whole profile, that it enhances your application, submit it. If you're applying to things like STEM programs, nursing programs, other popular majors, computer science, thank you. Yeah, things that are even more competitive than the college as a whole or university as a whole, absolutely submit it, particularly if your math score is good. Don't submit it if your scores, we say below the 30th percentile. That is, again, not a hard and fast rule. It's a guideline. If your scores are below the 30th percentile for admitted students at that school, not 30th percentile nationally, but based on those score ranges that you can find in Debbie's tool and elsewhere, that's probably going to be a detractor to your application. If you feel like the score hurts your application based on the rest of the profile, leave it out. Again, assuming a school is test optional. Again, these are very general guidelines, but it's important to kind of get a sense. We talked a little bit about this, but local context matters. If your student goes to a high school where they know that everybody takes the SAT and that score is missing, colleges know that. So they're going to assume that the score wasn't good. So they will not explicitly count it against you. But, my kid goes to a competitive high school. Every single kid takes the SAT. If he were to submit a college application without it, they're going to assume that it wasn't good. Does that affect the application? I have to assume that it does in some sort of way. Again, it's not explicitly counted against them. There are some states where SAT and ACT are required for graduation, and those tests, are offered during the school day. Many times those are printed on your transcript, so you don't really have a choice as to whether or not to submit it. And they're absolutely going to know your kid took it because they know it's a graduation requirement. So again, the local context of your student's high school and geographic area is important. Timeline, I'm going to go through this really fast. Rising juniors, the key thing to know, so students who are, actually this wouldn't be rising, the kids in junior year now, key thing to know is Algebra 2 timing really affects the best timing for prep. If they're in Algebra 2, you want to wait until the second half of the year to prep is our general guideline. If they're completed with Algebra 2, you want to get it done as early as you can in the junior year. Again, very broad. If early decision is a factor and or if athletic recruiting is a factor, you're going to want to make sure you have prep done and scores done sooner because those deadlines are sooner. The longer you wait, the more you are kind of in a rush. So test prep takes time. There are no miracles. Our programs run 2 to 5 months. So again, don't wait till fall of their senior year to start this process because being able to put the time into it is what will give you the results. Further away you are from Algebra 2, the rustier your math skills get. The SAT and ACT cover only through the end of Algebra 2, nothing beyond it. essentially nothing beyond it. So don't wait too long. Sometimes kids who are in calculus struggle with the math sections because they're just rusty on the earlier stuff. When possible, don't wait until senior year. There's a lot of other key pieces happening in senior year that take time and attention from your student that can take away from prep. That's what I got for you. In terms of super briefly who we are, obviously, as I mentioned, we're a tutoring company. Debbie will send out some information. We work with students on academic subjects as well as all the different major tests, AP exams. So we are here to help and to serve as a resource. My staff is awesome. And if you have questions and want to call in and get advice, they are happy to provide free advice on, the testing, the timeline, our experience, what we think. So we are here to help if you need it. I know this process is complicated and messy and just a lot of pieces. So, we're happy to serve as a resource to help as you need.
And I put in, somebody asked about signing up for a sample test, a practice test. So I put the link in the chat, but there'll also be an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and a link to StudyPoint and more information, about their programs. But do you mind, Katie? There's a few good.
No, totally fine. I'm happy to stay. Again, I feel badly I talked too long, but I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have.
So one mother is asking that, or saying that her daughter actually did use Khan Academy to do test prep and did increase her SAT, but feels that she's hit a ceiling with Khan Academy. Do you really think that a student could go further in improving if they did something like working with StudyPoint, a more one-on-one approach?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the specific situation, but in general, yes, Khan Academy is a great tool for practice problems and for working through practice problems and kind of drilling through it. And I think it's absolutely a valuable and useful tool. It's different than having a tutor sit with you and explain to you why you got it wrong. So Khan Academy has some great recorded videos, which can be really helpful if your student grasps the way that it teaches, and it can really give you some good information. I have found with my own kids and in my professional life that having someone there with you so that you can ask questions and interact with and get the help can really kind of get you through that wall where you feel like you've hit a wall on a score.
Somebody's asking, is the SAT process different for homeschoolers?
It's not different, other than in some cases for homeschool students, even if a school is test optional, they will require a test score.
Yes,
But the process in terms of taking it and all that kind of stuff, exactly the same.
And somebody is asking, if you don't mind, to just repeat what you talked about with Algebra 2, like how,
Important, and I said it fast. Yeah. So the key thing to know about math is that the SAT and the ACT cover essentially only through the end of Algebra 2. So kids take Algebra 2 at different points. Some kids take it as early as freshman year. I would say the majority or big chunk of kids take it sophomore year. Some kids take it junior year. Some kids don't take it till senior year. So the key thing to know is the best moment to prep for most students is as close to the end of Algebra 2 as possible. So if your student were in Algebra 2, say, as a sophomore, prepping as soon as they're done, like that summer or early fall, is great because the Algebra 2 is very fresh in their mind and the things that came before it are relatively fresh in their mind. The further you get away from Algebra 2, so as they move into pre-calc and calculus and all that kind of stuff, the rustier some of those earlier skills get. So if you have a student who's advanced in math, having them wait to take the SAT or ACT until they've gone even further in math counterintuitively can be bad because they can get really rusty. Again, all the time we talk to parents who are, are having students who are in like BC calculus AP and bomb the math section and the parent's totally stumped. And the reason why the kid says, yeah, I took Algebra 2 like in 8th grade. I don't remember some of it. And you don't use a lot of it in some of the later math courses, so they get rusty. So that's the key, is as close to the end of Algebra 2 as possible. That can be complicated if your student's taking Algebra 2 as a junior, let alone a senior. So if it's a junior student in Algebra 2, we say, don't necessarily wait till it's all over, because we don't like this to bleed into senior year if we can avoid it, but do the test prep later in the year. Start like in January or February, prep for something like a May or June test in the junior year, so that you've got the bulk of it under your belt. Because, you know, us or any other test prep company can't teach your kid all of Algebra 2, right? It's a whole year course. We can do some review and a little bit of filling in of gaps, but we want the student to have as much of it under their belt as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And maybe as like one of the last questions is that the practice test that you guys administer,
Yep.
does that help decide between whether a student should take an ACT versus an SAT?
Yeah, good question. There are a lot of companies that have tools, even some are even online, where you can answer like 5 or 6 SAT questions and 5 or 6 ACT questions, and it'll tell you which one you can take. We have not found those to be particularly reliable or helpful. They're a little gimmicky. They're cool, they're interesting, but they don't really give you a good solid picture, because so much of the difference between the tests is the pacing thing. And the pacing thing is important, that you sit for the whole exam and feel that pacing over the course of the 3-hour, again, I'm talking paper-based, over the course of the 3-hour test. So doing like a half section of math and a half section of reading doesn't really get at the true underlying differences between the tests in a way that we think is important. So what we do if a student if the two kind of key factors aren't leading us in one way or the other, what we do is we have them either take both full-length practice tests and look at that concordance chart I mentioned earlier and say, okay, you have SAT of X, ACT of Y, which one's higher? Or if they've taken one before, so in many cases, students come to us with a PSAT, but no ACT, we have them take an ACT practice test and then compare. But we've really found that you need to take the full test to get a valid comparison, because the pacing and timing is such a big part of it.
So would you recommend, actually Beth is asking, it sounds like maybe her student wants to take both the SAT and the ACT. And how would you recommend that they prep for that? Prep for both?
Our recommendation is there is no reason to prep for both. It's more time, it's more money, it's more stress on your student. Taking both to figure out which to focus on, absolutely. Prepping for both again, to be blunt, is a bit of a waste of time. You're only going to end up submitting one or the other. They're not dramatically different. You know, I sometimes describe the two tests as like Burger King versus McDonald's, not like pizza versus Chinese food. You know, they're similar. There are certainly differences between Burger King and McDonald's, right? But they're not worlds apart. Around 70 or 80% of kids will score statistically about the same on both. Only that other 20 or 30% does significantly better on one or the other. So this is not a gigantic decision. It's more important to pick one and set up a good timeline and get a good prep plan going than it is to really agonize over the choice. And there is really no good reason to prep for and take in an official way both tests. Spend the time up front, choose the one that plays to your student's strengths, and go full in on one or the other.
So just remind me, I'm just reading a question here. If you have a student who's a junior, they won't. Will they have the ability to take the new SAT? No, they won't.
No
So
digital for them.
Right. A woman who's asking that she thinks her student will do much better on the new SAT, but she's a junior, and unfortunately she's not going to have that option. Not
a choice. Yeah. Only sophomores have a choice, current sophomores. Juniors, fully paper. Freshmen and below, fully digital.
And you mentioned this kind of briefly, but maybe just talk a little bit more. Somebody's asking about how long are the prep programs? Like, what is a good amount of time to set aside to make sure that your student doesn't feel rust in prepping?
Absolutely. It again depends a lot on the individual situation, but our programs run from 2 to 5 months. So our most common program is a 15-week, which is 4-ish months, and we usually add a buffer week or 2 in there for vacations or sicknesses. So that's our kind of flagship program, is a 15-lesson, 15-week program. We have shorter and longer, but generally you want to give it at least a few months, because this is complicated stuff, and it's testing strategies and timing and content, and a lot of it will help them in other areas of testing as well. Sadly, this is not the last standardized test most students will take. They will take others later. So we want to build, our program approach is to build test prep strategies that certainly apply to the specific test, but also our general test-taking life skills. That stuff takes time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Katie. I told everybody, I hope you agree that there was a ton of good information here. And that, there's several different issues going on, and we find it's important to just bring these types of, presentations and information to families. This is not to say your student has to test prep, but at least now you have all the information to discuss it and make a better decision. So thank you, Katie. And everybody, you'll get a link to the recording tomorrow with more information if you want to follow up with StudyPoint. I just actually put in here that you guys are very open. People can call, they can ask questions, They can discuss their situation. Again, not yet knowing what they want to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Definitely.
Okay. Well, everyone, good night, and probably won't be talking about testing again before the holidays, so enjoy your holiday.